Hello, my dear class 12 history students. Welcome back once again to history class. Today we will continue what we have left from the previous class, that is chapter 10 on the chapter colonialism and rural society. And today we are going to discuss on two topics, that is Roadway settlement and rural indebtedness. This will be the two topics for today. So let us first get into the Roadway settlement, and under this we will see what are the features of this Roadway settlement and how did the introduction of this Roadway settlement it affected the Indian peasants. And please don't forget to remember that all these land settlements are a byproduct of British rule in India, which affected the Indian peasants. So please do keep in mind. So what is this Roadway settlement? So if we are to see the background of this Roadway settlement, when we say Roadway, it means it is referring to a tenant farming or an Indian peasants. So the land settlement, if we are going by definition, then the land settlement that the British introduced in the Deccan region, that is in the western part of India, in this region, especially in the state of Bombay, it is known as a Roadway settlement. Please remember that the land revenue or the land tax settlement that the British introduced in this region, that is in the Deccan region, this is known as Roadway settlement. It was first started by Munro, who was the Viceroy of India at the time. So the brainchild for starting this Roadway settlement in India was Munro in the year 1820. Kindly keep in note of all these names and then the years, which will be very important for you. And then it was introduced in the region of Bombay, Madras, and Assam. Please remember that the Roadway settlement it reached even to the geographical extent of Assam. But please remember that we are mainly focusing on the Deccan region of India, that is on the western part of India. So Roadway settlement is a land settlement that the British introduced in the region of Deccan, especially Bombay. It was started by Munro in the year 1820 in the region of Bombay, Madras, and Assam. So what are the features of this Roadway settlement? Or what are the main points of this Roadway settlement? So under this Roadway settlement, the first feature is that under this settlement, there was individual ownership of land, unlike the permanent settlement, which we have already discussed in the previous tutor. So under the permanent settlement, the zamindars who collected taxes from the peasants were made the owner of the land, in a sense that the real owner they lost the ownership of their own land. But here, under this Roadway settlement, the British they made the individual as the owner of the land. That's the first point. But contradictory to the first point, here all lands, the second point is that all lands were claimed by the government and they allotted directly to the peasants on the basis of the amount that they could pay to the British, which means that though land belonged to the individual, the entire area of the village or the land, it was claimed by the state, and then the state allotted the individual to cultivate on that particular or on that small plot of land where the peasants they need to cultivate those portions. So the entire land was claimed by the government, and then the peasants were allotted only a small portion of land. The third point is that the revenue or taxes were fixed on the basis of the quality of the soil or on the basis of the productivity of the soil. So if you are given this small plot of land and if your soil is very fertile, then the amount of taxes might be high. If your soil is not so fertile or barren, the amount of tax you need to pay to the British government might be low. So the taxes or the land revenue were fixed on the basis of the productivity or on the quality of the soil. The next point under this Roadway settlement or under the features of this Roadway settlement is that the rate of land revenue changes every 30 years. So every 30 years, the rate or the amount of land revenue, it changes every 30 years. But here again, one contradictory point here is that the government has the authority to increase the revenue whenever or wherever they wanted, which means that even if the land revenue were to be fixed, or even if the land tax were to be changed every after 30 years, the government has all the power or all the authority to change those land revenue or land tax anytime they wanted. So those are the features of the roadway settlement. Now we will discuss about the impacts or the effects of this roadway settlement. The first is that this land settlement, which was introduced in the region of Deccan, especially in Madras, especially in Bombay, it benefited the government and the zamindars and the moneylenders. So which means that the Indian peasants were being exploited by the government. The whole idea of the introduction of this land settlement, known as this roadway settlement, is to extract maximum profit from the Indian farmers or the poor Indian cultivators. The second point is that the revenue demand or the land tax was fixed at a very high rate that many Indian villages, they deserted the village and migrated to new places. And that is why it led to the decline or the downfall or the failure of this roadway settlement. Since they implemented a policy in this region, in the region of Bombay, but then if there is no people, then there will be no laws to implement it. So when the British government fixed the land revenue or the land tax to a very high standard, the peasant could not able to pay, so they left the village and migrated to new places. So these are the effects of the roadway settlement, and it led to the failure of this roadway settlement. In addition, there was one incident or there was one historical happening that was going on in India at that time. That is the Great Famine of 1932 to 34. So in 1932, especially 1932 to 34, there was a severe famine, and in this famine, many of the cattle which the peasants or the farmers were rearing died, and more than half of the population here in the region of Deccan died. So this severe famine, it also affected the Indian peasants. And for the peasants, to own a cattle is the treasure. And once they lost their cattle, it also leads to the loss of productivity of their farming, since they use it for manure, for agriculture, and as well as milk and meat production. So the loss of their cattle in the famine, the Great Famine of 1932 to 34, it affected the Indian peasants. Another reason which affected, or one more incident which affected the Indian peasants, was the cotton boom. And in your page 204, if you flip there, you will find the effects of cotton boom. And you know what is cotton, and if we are to define what is boom in economic term, it means increase in business activity or a market or an economy. Increase in market activity or in economy, or increase in market activities. So the question here is, how is this cotton boom, it affected the Indian peasants? And when we say boom, it means positive impact. But how did this cotton boom, it affected the Indian peasants? So for this topic, I'll take you back to another picture which is inside your syllabus, which is inside your textbook only. So till 1860, please remember that the British, they depended on America for the import of cotton. So America, the American, they supply a huge quantity of cotton to Britain. And the question here comes again, why do the British industries, they needed cotton? And if you look at the time frame, we are talking about 1860s, and here in 1860s, industrial revolution was going on in England. And those industries in England, they needed a huge quantity of cotton in order to produce finished product, or in order to produce cotton cloth, garments, etc. That's why the British, they needed a huge quantity of cotton. And for that, the British, they depended largely on America for the import of cotton for the industries before 1860. But after 1860, Civil War broke out in America, and I'm sure you must be aware that from 1860 to 65 there was a civil war in America, which led to the abolition of slavery under Abraham Lincoln. That was for your information. But when civil war was going on in America from 1860 to 65, when we say civil war, it is an internal war. And when internal war was going on, then the American farmers, they cannot go to the fields, to the farm to cultivate cotton or to produce cotton. And therefore, the supply of cotton from America to Britain, it declined drastically. It declined to a great extent. Now the British, they no longer get what they required from America, and for that the British, they turned their attention towards India for the production of cotton. Please keep in mind that before 1860 the British depended on America for the production of cotton, but when Civil War broke out in America, America could no longer supply cotton to British, and therefore the British turned their attention towards India for the production of cotton. And then the British tried to increase the production of cotton in India by borrowing money or by lending money to the Indian peasants through the moneylenders, through the zamindars. But here again, in 1865, the American Civil War ended in the year 1865. And when American Civil War ended in the year 1865, everything came back to normalcy. Once the farmers could not able to go to the field, now they return back to their normal life where they can go to the field, to the farm, and cultivate cotton. In that way, the production of cotton increased in America. And when the production of cotton increased in America, the British went back to the old market, to their old market, that is America. Which means that the British no longer need Indian cotton, no longer depended on India, which the once depended when American Civil War was going on. So the British went back to their old market, that is America, for the import of cotton. And in that way, here the Indian peasants who were cultivating cotton, who took loan from the moneylenders, from the zamindars for the cultivation of cotton, they landed in debt. And when the Indian farmers could no longer able to sell their cotton to the British, then they ended in debt. And this gives us to our next topic, that is rural indebtedness. How did all these factors led to the indebtedness of the Indian peasants or the Indian farmers or the cultivators? And it might be an exaggerated fact, but in your page 204 you will find that just for a loan of rupees 100, the moneylenders, they charge rupees 2000 as interest. That was the kind of extortion, that was the kind of exploitation the Indian peasants have to face in the hands of those moneylenders, in the hands of those zamindars, etc. And that, in fact, it led to indebtedness of the peasant. So now we will go to the next topic, that is rural indebtedness. And when we say rural, it means not of the town, in the countryside. And indebtedness, as you all know, indebtedness in its simplest definition, it means being in debt or the obligation of repayment, which means that the peasants have taken money and then the peasants need to repay. That is indebtedness. So we are going to see the effects of colonialism on the Indian society, especially referring to the countryside. So before going into rural indebtedness, one of the great historians, a professor by profession, Dr. R.C. Majumdar, he says that the first evil consequences of British rule in India was the economic exploitation of India. So if you look at the quotation, the first evil consequences of British rule was the economic exploitation of India. That is the picture of the British rule in India, was to exploit economically, was to exploit the Indian peasants. So this rural indebtedness, it is the overall collection of points which we have already discussed in the previous tutor. So here you will find that under the permanent settlement, the zamindars, the moneylenders, and the British exploited the Indian peasants. Under the Roadway Settlement, which we have already discussed, this settlement, it benefited only the government, only the British government. Please keep in mind that. So the kind of land settlement that the British introduced in India, either be it a permanent settlement or a roadway settlement or a mahalway settlement, it only focused on the exploitation of the Indian peasants, and it led to indebtedness of those farmers. Under the British rule, land became a personal property, and it led to indebtedness of the peasants, which means under the British rule, there was a fragmentation of land holding. And if you look up here at the board, you will find that before, land was not a personal property. So if a farmer wished to cultivate a bigger plot of land, he can do so. But once the British owned all this particular plot of land, they give specific areas to the farmers or to the cultivators. If he wished to cultivate a bigger plot, it cannot. Why? Because the portion of land belongs to others and not to him, which leads to less productivity. He cannot produce more. And that is why when he cannot produce more, he obviously needs the help of those moneylenders, those zamindars to survive. And when those moneylenders, they offered help, they help those peasants, those cultivators with a very high rate of interest, and that in turn led to indebtedness. Please remember that. With the coming of the British, the Indian peasants, apart from paying land tax or land revenue at a very high rate, they started paying taxes on essential commodities like salt, sugar, oil, etc. So all these things are very new to the Indians, which they have not been doing, and that extra burden of taxes, it led to indebtedness of the Indian peasants. Under the British rule, forests became a monopoly of the state. Forests became the property of the state. Now the farmers have to buy even firewood for cooking to the government or to the British. Now, when they need to purchase or buy firewood, the Indian farmers or the poor cultivators, they turn to other source, that is the cow dung. In rural lives, if you see those videos, you will find an elderly Indian women pasting a cow dung on the wall. And after drying up, they used to take those cow dungs and they burn for cooking purposes. Once they started using those cow dungs, then the productivity or the fertility of the soil, it reduces because the manure which they have been using, now they turn it for cooking purposes. So it also affected the productivity of the soil, which led to indebtedness. Besides all these factors which were introduced by the British affected the Indian peasants, the Indian farmers or the peasants, they do lots of spending on ceremonies like marriages, death, etc. All this affected to the economy of the Indian peasants. And in addition to that, natural calamities like flood, severe famine, all this also added to the burden of the Indian peasants, and all this in fact led to indebtedness of the peasants. So please keep in mind that India, before the coming of the British rule, was a self-sufficient village economy. And when we say self-sufficient, which it meant that whatever they need, they produce by themselves, and it enabled them to sustain their life. But with the coming of the British, they introduced different kinds of land settlement. They introduced different kinds of land policy, a land revenue, a land tax, which exploited the Indian peasants. And all this led to indebtedness, and all this draws back to our topic, to our chapter, colonialism and rural society, colonialism and its impact on the Indian society. So I encourage you to go through your text. From the next tutor, we will be continuing with chapter 11, a new chapter, that is representation of 1857. I encourage you to at least go through your textbook once, so that once we get back into our tutor class, you will be familiarized with our topic. Yeah, thank you.